The American dream: work hard, get the house, have kids, and raise them right. And hopefully they'll also succeed. They'll do well in sports, go to college, graduate, and do well in their careers. This was the seemingly ordinary life for one family living in Akron, Ohio in 2020. But all of that was shattered on March 3rd when an unthinkable crime occurred. One that makes you question how well you know and can trust your own flesh and blood. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 44 of the Darklivity podcast. I'm your host, Kimbyrleigha, and I'm here with my co-host, my best friend. His hair is a little messy today. Say hello to Jonathan.
Hi. Darklivity. It's the dark downward slope into the degradation of the human mind and the consequences that such darkness brings to light.
And by the way, Jonathan was pronouncing something wrong in our definition for a while, weren't you, babe?
Oh.
It's okay, guys. You know what? We're not perfect, as you probably are already aware. And no, I don't script the beginning when I introduce Jonathan, so it just comes out any way that it does.
My mind is a wonderful place.
It is. It's a dangerous place too. Now, if you've been an avid true crime watcher or listener for a while, then you've probably heard about this case. I can say I was really shocked when I first heard about it, and I wanted to truly understand how in the world something like this could happen. So instead of our usual format where we go into the bio and then tell you how everything went down, this story has to be told a little bit differently. For one, this was a very private family. A normal family. As I said in the intro, they were living a seemingly ordinary life out in Akron, Ohio. They weren't the type with a huge social media following or a lot to uncover about their past, so we really can't tell you much about that. The truly remarkable part about this family was actually the crime. And because this family is so private, it got me thinking about how I like to stay as private as possible and how important it is, especially these days with so many scams going around with our public data. I've been the victim of credit card fraud more times than I like to admit. And that's why I think about a year ago, I got Surfshark VPN for our family, and I love it. I use it all the time now, and they're partnering with us today for this video. And if you've heard of a VPN before, I think a lot of people are needing them more than ever right now. But I think they can also be kind of confusing, but it's simple. With Surfshark, it's like wearing a disguise when you browse the web, and it keeps you secure and hidden. I've been using it a lot more lately when I'm in public because I used to feel fine using public Wi-Fi, but then I found out that's probably how all of my data got leaked in the first place. So I love that I can just put it on right when I'm out at Starbucks, anywhere, and I feel safe.
When you use Surfshark, your internet traffic is fully encrypted. No snoopers, no hidden trackers, no nosy neighbors. You can also virtually travel around the world, stream your favorite shows from different countries, and even block annoying ads and malware. It's like giving your entire household a protective layer of online security. Plus, with Surfshark, one subscription covers unlimited devices, giving everyone in your home secure, worry-free browsing.
And I've been seeing more and more of these elaborate scams than ever before, especially with the rise in AI. There are also entire forums online where hackers will exchange tips and tricks, and guess who they go after first? People with unsecured networks. Surfshark makes it harder for people with evil intentions to get to you. With Surfshark One, you get an officially certified antivirus software as well, and a built-in ad-free private search tool, and my favorite, a data breach warning system. They will alert you when your data has been compromised, whether it's your email, your ID, your credit card, or other personal data. If it gets leaked online, they will let you know so you can take the necessary steps and fast.
You can even create a brand new online identity with a proxy email using Surfshark's alternative ID. This helps avoid data leaks and an inbox full of spam. When you use our link below, surfshark.com/darklivity, or the QR code on the screen, you can get a premium VPN for less than a cup of coffee, plus 4 extra months.
You also get a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can take your time to try the whole Surfshark experience. And thank you so much to Surfshark for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's get into the case for today. 54-year-old Stephen Powell and his 50-year-old wife, Brenda, and their 2 children, 19-year-old Sydney and her younger brother, Andrew, lived at 1965 Scudder Drive in a modest 3-bedroom home that was only about 1,000 square feet, and it looked like it hadn't changed that much since it was built in 1957. This was a quiet street in a small neighborhood where everyone that lived there grew up together. Although, like many of us, they hardly had any time to keep in touch. Everyone was busy with their own lives, working hard to make ends meet and give their children the good life. Brenda graduated from the University of Akron and had worked as a child life specialist at Akron's Children's Hospital for the last 28 years. She worked at the hospital's Showers Family Center for childhood cancer and blood disorders, specializing in the hematology oncology department. For living what many thought was an ordinary life, Brenda was an extraordinary person. She was the one that was often by her patient's side for the hardest parts of their treatments. Supporting children suffering from cancer, I don't think there can be a job that gets harder than that. And I don't think just anyone would be cut out for this job. But Brenda seemed made for it. It sounds cliche, but I read so many of her patients' stories about the way that Brenda cared for them. One patient said that she was diagnosed with leukemia when she was 16 and underwent chemotherapy for 2.5 years. And Brenda was by her side the whole time. She said that Brenda was always just so uplifting, and as soon as she walked in, her smile would brighten up the whole room. She wasn't the type to just show up for work, clock in, and take home a paycheck. She always went the extra mile to organize events for her patients, like a prom to remember. Another one of her patients mentioned the office at the hospital looked like a whole box of dresses exploded. And that's because Brenda made sure that each and every one of the young girls had their dream of a fairy tale prom come true. For one night, they could unhook from the beeping machines, get out of their hospital gowns, and put on a prom gown. The patients were movie stars for that night. They got to drive up in limos, walk the red carpet, and dance the night away at this gala that was created just for them. Julia Tingler, now 30 years old, was diagnosed with cancer when she was 17. She said that Brenda just wanted us to forget that an IV machine was attached to us for a minute and try to make us feel beautiful. That is who we're talking about when we talk about Brenda Powell. Besides working hard to make sure her patients were always cared for, Brenda's biggest joy was her job as a mother. She loved going to her children's sporting events when they were growing up and cheering them on from the sidelines.
At the time, Stephen Powell was working as the vice president of quality assurance at his family's business, Akron Steel Treating. He'd been in that role for the past 10 years. The company is family-owned and was founded back in 1943 by Stephen's father. Brenda and Steve met in 1995 through mutual friends, Kenneth Deese and his wife. Ken was a detective with the Akron Police Department. Ken's wife was friends with Brenda, and Ken himself was Steve Powell's childhood friend.
I told you this was a close-knit community where many people knew one another and grew up together, further complicating things and, of course, adding to the intensity of this tragedy.
Brenda and Steve got married in 1996 and stayed close friends with Ken and his wife. And a few years later, their daughter Sydney was born on March 21st of 2000. 3 years after that, their son Andrew was born. Both Sydney and Andrew were raised Catholic and went to St. Sebastian's for elementary and middle school. And for high school, Sydney went to St. Vincent's. In high school, Sydney played soccer and did really well academically, graduating with an unweighted 3.8 GPA and a 27 on her ACT.
Yes, and both Steve and Brenda took pride in their careers, and they worked hard to instill the same work ethic in their children. I wouldn't say that it was pressure that they put on their kids, but I think there was a certain expectation when you're growing up in a household where both of your parents work really hard.
The Powell kids seem to have no trouble succeeding in meeting expectations. Teachers described Sydney as a quiet, smart people pleaser. She made the honor roll every semester and never got below a B. One teacher was so impressed with Sydney's faith and character that she asked her to mentor younger students at a school-sponsored religious retreat, hoping that others would look up to her and follow her example.
This family was really close. Brenda and Sydney had a very strong bond. Teachers, friends, and family members were aware of the closeness between Sydney and her mom. Brenda and Steve made it a point to bond with both of their children. Every year, they would take a break from their 9-to-5s and take their family on a vacation to Disney World out in Orlando, Florida, and have a fun time on the beach together. They were truly seen as a typical all-American family. Sydney was described as Brenda's mini-me. They even looked alike. Except Brenda had these striking blue eyes and Sydney's were brown, but everything else was spot on.
And Sydney graduated high school in 2018 and got accepted into Mount Union College in Alliance, Ohio, which is about a 45-minute drive from her family's home.
And due to her grades, Sydney actually got a significant academic scholarship covering a large portion of the estimated cost of almost $50,000 per year plus tuition.
However, she had to maintain a minimum cumulative GPA of 3.0 to keep her scholarship.
That doesn't seem like it would be too hard for someone like Sydney, who was somewhat of an overachiever. Or so you'd think. But college is not high school. There are a lot of distractions: guys, partying, alcohol, late nights, sorority events, hanging out with new friends, and so much more. Sydney was human. She wasn't perfect, and it was clear that neither were her grades. Her parents were paying for her tuition for everything in excess of the money that she was granted from the school, plus all of her rooming expenses and anything else that came along with college life: food, clothing, you name it. And they expected Sydney to be a diligent student and study hard, like many parents do. But they knew this was a big life change. She was going to be on her own for the very first time. So they kept tabs on her. After all, she had just turned 18 when she got into college. So the family used the Life 360 app to stay connected. I mean, they also feared for their child's safety. Even your adult children these days, something could happen. Maybe they won't answer. I mean, how many times have we heard cases about college students, something bad happening to them? I think it's perfectly normal for parents to want to make sure their children are okay.
I mean, everything seems pretty normal so far.
It does. And that's why this case was so shocking, because Sydney, this overachiever, smart, talented, good student with a lot of promise for her future, killed her mother. Sydney killed Brenda on March 3rd of 2020. That was the tragedy that catapulted this ordinary family into the spotlight. This case fascinated the public. Everyone wants to understand the darker aspects of human nature, to make sense of the seemingly senseless, and to get a glimpse into the complexities of the legal system and unravel any hidden secrets that could have led to such a heartbreaking outcome. And there were secrets and madness. So let's dive deeper.
All right, so here's the situation. This case is about matricide, which is when someone kills their mother. In this case, it involves 19-year-old Sydney Powell, who killed her 50-year-old mother, Brenda Powell. Before we dive into the details, we need to talk about a major issue that came up both during the investigation and the trial. Sydney Powell appeared to have no clear motive for harming her mother, but that's not entirely accurate.
And of course, motive doesn't have to be proven in a court of law, but it is a nagging question in every case. Why? I don't want to scare you, but I'd like to start with the complex relationships between mothers and daughters specifically. I'm a mother. I have 2 daughters now. One is a teenager. So this topic interests me, but it also worries me. Mother-daughter relationships, as many of us know firsthand, can be intricate, multifaceted, and even at times dysfunctional. Any deep emotional connections have the potential for conflict, and mother and daughter's relationships are no different. Even though you would think that a child would never want to harm the person that gave them life, that nurtured them, cared for them, and raised them, especially in a family like the Powells. And that's why this case was one I really wanted to understand. It underscores the darker side of these relationships and provides a lens to examine them. The bigger of these is intergenerational expectations and pressure to perform or succeed. And sadly, I don't know if I'm just old school, because you know how it seems like elders from each generation look at the next and they kind of shake their heads. And I find myself doing the same thing. Not all the time, but sometimes. I feel that the younger generations just don't care as much. And Jon and I could talk about this all day long because it's fascinating. Like, all the technology is at their fingertips, but there's also a loss of pride in a career, or it seems like it to me.
I mean, I've noticed this at certain chain stores, but maybe it's because they know that one day automation or robots are just going to take their job, so why care in the first place?
I feel like that's true. And, I'm not trying to generalize an entire population of people. I'm just saying that sometimes, to me, I kind of roll my eyes. I mean, I had that experience this morning. I went somewhere and it seemed like no one wanted to be there. I just feel like things were a little bit different when I was younger. Being a CEO and having a salary and a 9-to-5 was actually a goal. But now I feel like things have shifted.
So things may have changed, but a lot of mothers still have specific hopes and expectations for their daughters, which can create some tension. Often mothers see their daughters as an extension of themselves, and that can make daughters feel pressured to live up to those expectations, or even push back against them. That kind of dynamic can definitely lead to conflict at times.
Sure, and in this case, Sydney had big shoes to fill. So was it the pressure to succeed and Sydney not being able to live up to those expectations that led her to murder one of the most important people in her life? Well, let's tell you more about this case so that you can be the judge, because it may not be that simple. I want to take you back to the spring semester of Sydney's second year of college at Mount Union at the beginning of 2020. that is when her lies really began. She was notified a month earlier in December of 2019 that due to the fact that she was failing her classes after she had been put on academic probation the semester prior, she was now being dismissed from the school. Now, my goal is not to make light of this situation, but at the same time, most of us know that being put on academic probation, it's not that big of a deal. I don't know if you've been on it. I have definitely been on it before, and things happen in college. Students can be dealing with a lot of stress and new unexpected experiences. And you know what? You can fall behind, and many people do. And in Sydney's case, she was very smart, but she did have some personal setbacks. She had dated someone, and guess what? It didn't work out. So she ended up breaking up with them. And then she had to go through the stress of pledging for a sorority, something I do not have firsthand knowledge of, but I've heard can be very overwhelming. But I think the most pressing issue for Sydney, according to what her best friend and roommate Lauren Curry explained, was that Sydney couldn't figure out what she wanted to do in her life. And therefore, she couldn't figure out what to major in. And she was taking a bunch of random classes. But then she would realize she wasn't interested in them. And then she just kept having to switch, all within just the first few months of school. Now, this is something that I can understand, and I'm sure a lot of you can too. I was a biblical studies major when I first got into college because I was fascinated with history and understanding manuscripts like the Bible. But look at what I'm doing now. And in college, I ended up getting a degree in psychology and sociology. So not exactly what I planned. And that means all the money that you spent when you didn't know what you wanted to do pretty much goes down the drain unless you can work those classes into a new major.
Right. And I feel that taking a gap year after high school is really important. I mean, it's hard to figure out what you want to do for the rest of your life. It's insanely hard. And a lot of people go into something, spend a few years on it, and then realize that they don't even like it.
And some people get a degree. Like I have 3 degrees and I don't even do what I went to school for.
Right. So you can understand how difficult it might be for someone who's only 18, starting college with barely any life experience. With all their friends, they seem happy, successful, and sure of what they want to do. She started feeling like she didn't have her shit together. And those were her words when she opened up to her friends and the people that were closest to her.
You're right. And to make matters worse, it was actually Sydney's idea to go to Mount Union. She had been friends with Lauren for 6 years at the time, and they did everything together. Sydney visited the school first, and she said she liked it, but she wasn't really sure if she wanted to go there and commit to it. But then Lauren visited, and she just knew it was the place to be. So when she got back home, she told Sydney that they had to go there together. So now you have your best friend, who I wouldn't say is pressuring you to go to this college, but she's super excited, and you do everything together. And maybe it wasn't the right place for Sydney, but she went along with her best friend, who in my opinion was kind of the opposite of Sydney. Lauren was a cheerleader. She was bubbly, blonde, and smiley and wanted to be a teacher. And please don't get mad at me for saying this. She kind of reminds me of the type of girls that I went to school with that just wanted to get their MRS degree. If you know, you know. And if you don't, some people go there to get married. MRS, Mrs. They kind of slide by getting decent grades, being pretty and popular, and then they fall in love with, I don't know, the guy that's becoming a doctor, let's just say. I don't think Sydney fell into that category. I truly think she wanted to do something big, but seeing everyone around her stress-free and thriving, it took a toll on her.
In her first semester, Sydney started majoring in exercise science, but after a few weeks, she realized it wasn't for her, so she switched to psychology and sociology. But unfortunately, after taking a couple classes, she figured out she didn't like that either. She kept noticing how happy Lauren and her friends were while studying education, so Sydney thought maybe that was the answer. By her 3rd semester, she switched her major again and started taking education courses. But guess what?
I'm going to say I don't think she liked that either.
Nope, she didn't.
That's a lot of switching. And if you've been in college, you know it sets you back each time you switch because then you have to take all the new prerequisites and then all the required classes. So that is very overwhelming. But Sydney was in a more unique situation because not only was it frustrating to not know what she wanted to do, but she was about to lose all of her funding since her grades dropped so much. But Sydney didn't confide in Lauren or any of her other friends about what she was going through. Sure, she mentioned she didn't know exactly what she wanted to do with her career, but her pride kept her from admitting the truth, that she'd been put on academic probation. She'd been lying to everyone in her life. Back at the beginning of the school year, the fall of 2019, she was given 1 semester on probation to turn things around. But that didn't happen for various reasons. Sydney made it to her classes, she made it to the student union where she was supposed to be studying, and she made it to all of her sorority meetings, but she never managed to turn in her school assignments to improve her grades. Come December of 2019, during her winter break, while Sydney was back at home with her parents who were busy at work, a notice was mailed to the home, certified mail, and Sydney signed for it. The letter informed her that she had now been suspended from the university for the spring semester due to her grades not coming back up. So she knew the details. That is a fact. However, she was allowed to reapply and then be readmitted to the university the following semester.
But instead of coming clean to her parents, who, by the way, were super loving and understanding and would probably have helped Sydney in any way they could, she acted like everything was fine and went back to campus in January after the break. In her first year at Mount Union, she and Lauren lived in the dorms, but this year they were moving into a nicer on-campus suite.
Yes, they were in the Alpha Chi Omega sorority, and ironically, what drew them in to that particular sorority was that it did charity work for DV. They thought that was a really good cause.
The first hint that something was off came when Sydney and Lauren arrived at their new suite. Usually, the RA would welcome the new residents by putting their names on the doors of their rooms. Lauren's name was there, and so were all the other names of the girls in the suite, but Sydney's name was missing.
I was surprised that they were still doing this because they did it when I was in college too. But just imagine how upset you would be if you arrived and everyone else's name was there and yours was just missing. So of course, Sydney knew why right away, but she didn't say. So of course, they thought the RA didn't include Sydney, and Lauren was going to march right down there and ask what was going on. But Sydney was like, no, don't worry about it. I'll get it all sorted out. It must be some kind of mistake.
It was a subtle red flag, but still, it stood out. Sydney brushed it off, saying there must have been a mistake when filling out one of the forms that the school had sent before the break. She figured that she must have accidentally checked the box saying she didn't plan to return to campus instead of the one confirming that she'd be back.
Right. This is what she's saying to her friends because she knew what was going on. But she's like, oh, I must have made a mistake on that one form. Kind of seems plausible, simple mistake. But then again, would a college not know that you paid your tuition and were enrolled? It seems like that would be quite the oversight.
Exactly. Sydney wasn't enrolled. She hadn't signed up for classes, there was no tuition payments, and she didn't have any accommodations, but she acted like everything was completely normal.
But the next red flag that something wasn't right was when Sydney's key card to get into the buildings on campus wasn't working that week. She had a physical key to their room that she shared with Lauren since Lauren had been given two, and she gave one of them to Sydney to use. But Sydney was not able to enter any of the other doors on campus with her key card. However, since she walked around with Lauren and their other friends, they would swipe their key cards. Plus, Sydney knew a lot of other classmates on campus. And sometimes it's true, key cards do have technical issues. So she just casually flagged someone down to let her in, and no one questioned it. Sydney was lying. Even if it was by omission, she knew why her key card wasn't working. The access had been revoked. She knew why her name wasn't on the door. She wasn't a student. Yet there she was, going through the motions, pretending to go to class, even doing homework with Lauren, acting like everything was fine. This was her best friend. I can't imagine living with someone that you usually share everything with and just hiding all of this. Remember all this because it will become very important later on. Sydney was also lying to her family. Her mom and dad thought she was going to school and living in the suite with Lauren, and they were continuing to put money in her bank account so she could afford her necessities. And this went on. Not for days or weeks, but for months. All the while, when Brenda or Steve would open up the Life 360 app, Sydney was where she was supposed to be. She was on campus, so they never questioned it. And that was at first, though. Brenda was always on top of Sydney's schedule, or so she thought. Every semester, Sydney would give her mom all the information about her classes, what times they were at. Sure, there were times in other semesters when Brenda would notice Sydney was somewhere else instead of class. So she would casually ask Sydney what was going on. Is everything okay? But that was when Sydney was still enrolled. Back then, Sydney would let her mom know that maybe the class got canceled or they got out early, something that was probably true at the time. But as the weeks went on that spring semester, Brenda began noticing that Sydney was frequently not in class. So of course, like usual, she questioned her daughter about where she was. Now, Sydney was lying. But she was using some of the same excuses that had worked in the past. The professor had an emergency. The class was canceled. She had an exam and it was already over. Things like that. It worked before, but that was when there weren't other signs that something wasn't right.
When those excuses started wearing thin, Sydney told her mom that the class had been moved online and that she was in her dorm doing her coursework. Brenda probably did some digging, but she couldn't do much considering Sydney was an adult, and there are laws that protect students from having their information shared with their parents, even if the parents are paying for those classes.
Yeah, I think it's called FERPA. It's like the HIPAA for college students. It's the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and it prevents family members from being able to access any information if they call or if they go online, unless the student gives them permission or gives them the login information. But Brenda became deeply suspicious over time, questioning Sydney more and more, and this questioning showed the tension that was building in this mother-daughter dynamic. At one point, Brenda asked Sydney, quote, "Why do I feel like you're always scamming me? You need to keep up your grades so you don't lose your scholarship," end quote. To which Sydney responded, quote, "My grades are just fine. Thank you very much," end quote, which we know is a blatant lie. And Brenda's suspicions were well-founded. She knew something was off. She could sense it like many of us could. And I felt the whole "thank you very much" at the end of that sentence was telling. It's like she doesn't want to be challenged, and she definitely doesn't want to be seen as a failure. She has a lot of pride, and her ego was getting bruised, and that's something she didn't like. Brenda, like many mothers, was very perceptive when it came to her own daughter. I'm sure this wasn't the first time that Sydney had lied to her, and Brenda suspected that Sydney wasn't being 100% truthful about school. Perhaps it was intuition, and that's something that Sydney strived to prove wrong, even if it meant telling more lies to cover up previous lies. And if you've watched the Chandler Halderson case, or you know that story, lies beget more lies, and liars begin digging themselves into a hole that they can't get out of. Chandler basically lied about having a job at SpaceX after graduating from college. It's too deep to go into right now, of course, but let's just say the same thing you're hearing about is what he started doing, lying about going to class, lying about getting a job. And then he basically killed his parents because he never wanted them to find out that he was failing at life and lying about it. But going back to this case.
After the first month, Sydney was still fooling everyone. Even the school hadn't caught on. Then, into the second month, everything was still under wraps, and she managed to stay on campus for free without being enrolled. But by the end of that month, her lies started to unravel. On February 24th, the dean of students confronted Sydney. It all began when Sydney's roommate and best friend Lauren asked her to take on a leadership role in their sorority. When Lauren went to the admins to finalize Sydney's new position, they told her that Sydney wasn't even on the roster of current students, so they couldn't add her to the system for that role.
There are often GPA and conduct requirements to maintain standing in a sorority, and taking on a leadership role requires those things as well. First, it was the name on the door missing, then the issue with her key card, and now she's not on the school's roster. Of course, Lauren spoke to Sydney about this and another lie. Sydney said, "Oh, it must be a clerical error and I'll take care of it." Of course, that didn't happen. So Lauren eventually spoke with the Associate Dean of Students, Michelle Gaffney, about the situation.
For context, Michelle Gaffney had worked at Mount Union for over 29 years. She held a variety of positions and was very familiar with how the college operated. But Sydney was about to try to pull a fast one on her.
Right. Here's this woman who basically runs everything that has to do with students, yet Sydney is going to try to attempt to lie to her and say that she's still a student and has no idea why their system is wrong.
Michelle called Sydney, trying to be sensitive but firm, and questioned her why she was still living on campus if she wasn't enrolled. She instructed Sydney to come straight to her office to sort it out. And when Sydney arrived, she stuck to the same story that she'd been telling everyone else, that she was definitely enrolled and that there must be some kind of misunderstanding.
Michelle was actually caught off guard. She doesn't want to upset a student if there's really a legitimate issue, so she gives her the benefit of the doubt, thinking that there could have possibly been an appeal from Sydney that Michelle didn't know about. But it only took a couple clicks on the computer for Michelle to know there was no confusion. Sydney had no tuition on file, no schedule, no classes. For a second, Michelle thought, okay, maybe Sydney doesn't even know. Maybe she doesn't know she's not enrolled and she's just going to school like she is. But then she saw the copy of the registered letter that Sydney had signed for. She informed Sydney that her signature was on that letter and she was not a student any longer. But once again, Sydney put on a performance and she lied again, saying, "Oh, there must be a problem. I worked that out over the break. There's a delay in your system and it's just catching up." But Michelle was pretty stern at this point. She knew she was dealing with a former student that, for whatever reason, was trying to stay on campus, and she couldn't let that happen. So she told Sydney in no uncertain terms that she had to leave and move out as soon as possible. She also needed to turn over her key card. But that's when Michelle sensed Sydney's apprehension and her nervousness, and she offered to speak with Sydney's parents on her behalf, to work it out with them, to explain what was going on so that Sydney could make a comfortable transition. This wasn't the first time a student was dealing with being dismissed, and Michelle wanted to do everything she could to help make this as seamless as possible so that Sydney could come back the following semester if she wished.
Michelle knows that students don't want to disappoint their parents and that it can be hard to admit that they aren't doing well in school. So she offered to assist Sydney by getting on a call with her and her parents to explain the situation to discuss her options, especially since Sydney would have to move back home. But Sydney declined Michelle's help, saying that she would tell her parents herself, though she needed a little more time to gather her belongings to move out. Michelle was understanding and told her that they would give her a few days to get everything together and that she would check back in.
But spring break was coming up in just the first week of March, which was about a week away. It seemed like Sydney was going to bide her time and act like she was coming home because she was on break. More lying, until she could figure out what to do next. If she could make it to the beginning of May with all these lies and these stories, then the spring semester would be over, and then she could move on and possibly just pick back up in fall like nothing happened. And because Michelle was giving her the time to move out, they reactivated her key card. So now she can get in and out of all the buildings again, which helped her perpetuate the lie to all of her friends. She told them she was going to be taking some time off after the spring semester. She acted like this was a choice that she made, that she was going to leave after the spring semester and decide what major she wanted to do when she came back.
If she wasn't planning on telling her parents and wasn't saying anything to her roommates or friends, then where was she planning to stay from March to May?
Okay, that's the thing. I don't think she knew what her plan was. Maybe she would sleep in her car, which some of her friends later said they thought she was probably doing, as well as paying for hotels in cash and crashing at friends' houses between the time she left campus and the time that she had to go back home for her pretend spring break. I mean, it really was spring break, but I'm saying pretend because she wasn't on spring break because she's not a student. But during this time, she was actually going back to her parents' house, and her mom is now checking the Life 360 app. And she noticed that Sydney was at home and not in class. Brenda wondered if she wasn't on break yet, why was she at home right now? Of course, both her parents started questioning her about this, and she tells them things like, we're just having finals and we're getting out early every day. Meanwhile, Steve does some digging of his own, and he looks at his bank account and realizes the usual amount of tuition that comes out never did for the spring semester. So he tries to sign onto the student portal, which he had always had access to, and he's trying to find out what's going on, and he couldn't even get on. It just kept kicking him off. So he confronted Sydney asking what was going on. I mean, most schools would be more than happy to auto-withdraw money. And Sydney lies again. She says, it's some kind of technical error that the school is having, and she pretends that it has something to do with filling out the wrong form. She's using that excuse again. She says, don't worry, they're aware of the situation and they're fixing it. Steve believed his daughter. He didn't think at the time that this was that unusual. It's not that Sydney wasn't close to her dad, but she was much closer to her mom, and they weren't used to talking about these things together. She would usually go through Brenda, and if she had any issues, then Brenda would go to Steve and explain what was happening. So for her dad to come and confront her, that probably was very stressful and made her nervous.
She told her mom the same story, saying that she would be home for spring break on March 3rd around 2:30 p.m. after her classes were over. And once again, she's acting like everything was perfectly fine.
But Sydney was panicking inside. Of course, she felt the walls were closing in. These lies were getting harder and harder to maintain. Her situation was getting more difficult. She couldn't even handle college classes. How would she handle living on her own and lying about going to college for the next few months?
Then Monday, March 2nd rolls around, the day before the last day of classes before spring break. Sydney needed a place to stay, but she also missed the routine that she had on campus with her sorority sisters. On Monday nights, they always got together to watch The Bachelor. So she texted Laura to ask if it was okay if she could join them. Of course, Lauren said yes, and that's exactly what Sydney did that night. The next day, as planned, Sydney goes home, but she arrives much earlier than after classes would have ended. Meanwhile, her dad gets a phone call from Mount Union informing him that his daughter is no longer enrolled. The call was triggered because he had been trying to make a payment. When he asked how long she hadn't been enrolled, they told him that they couldn't disclose that information due to privacy laws and advised him to ask Sydney directly. Looking down at his Life 360 app, he noticed that Sydney was already at home. So we thought this might be a perfect opportunity to speak with her face to face and figure out what was going on.
At this point, he didn't know when all of this had happened, if possibly she had just been withdrawn from school that day. He had no idea that this had been going on for the last 3 months. But he really wanted to get to the bottom of it because he, like Brenda, suspected that Sydney was not telling him the whole truth. Even my teenager is under the assumption that I don't know how things work. And as we usually say, we weren't born yesterday. We've already been through pretty much everything that they're experiencing because we have been a teenager before. So maybe Sydney didn't realize that her family would catch on. But her dad was actually pretty sneaky about what he did next. He knew that just like he could check the Life 360 app and know where Sydney was, she could do the same and know exactly where he was. She expected him to be at work all day until he came home in the evening. So what did he do? He left his phone back at his office and he started to drive towards their house. He's not being tracked, so she doesn't know that he's coming to speak with her. Now, this part of the case was curious to me. It showed that he did go out of his way to hide the fact that he was coming home to speak to his daughter. I don't know why, but when I read this, it didn't really sit right with me. But maybe he thought, she would leave to avoid confrontation, and he wanted to catch her before she made another move and before Brenda came home.
It was around 11:15 a.m. His office is about 15 minutes away, so he arrived home around 11:30. Sydney was the only one there. Steve sat down with her to talk about what was going on. Sydney insisted that this had all happened recently, claiming she'd been enrolled the entire spring semester, attending her classes and even doing her homework. However, she did admit that she had been having trouble deciding what she wanted to study and wasn't sure if Mount Union was the right college for her to stay at. Steve told her that they would figure it out. He said just focus on getting through the spring semester, and if she needed to take the summer off, they'd handle it. That's when Sydney made the comment about how all her friends seemed to have their lives together, but she didn't.
Steve let her know that that wasn't true. After Sydney settled down a bit from being emotional over what was going on, Steve said they should probably call Brenda, because she was better at figuring out this kind of stuff. Maybe she could call the school to make sure Sydney's enrollment was reinstated, and they could go from there. But Steve doesn't know that his daughter has already been dismissed. There is no being reinstated. She would have no choice but to wait until the next semester starts again. Plus, she would actually have to reapply as a new student and go through the entire admissions process again. However, Steve did call Brenda, and he explained to her at the best of his knowledge what was happening. Right away, Brenda thought this situation was pressing enough because she cared about her daughter that she spoke to her supervisor about leaving early, and she was permitted to go home. Both Brenda and Steve left work that day because they knew their daughter needed them. Brenda left the hospital to come home and help Sydney with the college issues, and Steve left to go back to the office thinking that this was resolved, that he had nothing to worry about. It would have never crossed his mind that his wife would be in any kind of danger. And the guilt he felt was overwhelming because had he stayed, maybe things would have been different. But this is in no way Steve's fault. Why would any father imagine that something like this would happen in their own home to their family? It's shocking. It's unbelievable and incomprehensible. Steven got back to work and texted Brenda a few times talking about Sydney and the college issues. When Brenda pulled into their driveway, she called Steve to let him know that she was home and about to go speak with Sydney. At 12:36 p.m., Brenda texted Steve to let him know that she had just called the school and she was waiting for a call back from the student affairs representative for Mount Union. 1 minute later, Steve texted Brenda back, saying don't forget to check on the scholarship to make sure Sydney didn't lose it. It had only been about an hour since Steve had spoken to Sydney himself, yet so much had transpired already.
At 12:41, Steve texted his wife again asking, what did you discuss with Sydney? He didn't get a response, though, and probably didn't think much of it. He likely assumed Brenda was on the phone with the school or busy working things out with Sydney. But 10 minutes later, at 12:51 p.m., Steve got a call from his best friend, Ken Deese. You'll remember we mentioned Ken earlier. He's the one who introduced Brenda and Steve, and he's also the detective with the Akron Police Department. Ken was calling to let Steve know that he'd heard Steve's address come up over the radio with a report of an incident at his house. Ken didn't have any more details to share, but he was surprised to hear his best friend's address mentioned and was concerned, so he called Steve to give him a heads up.
Right away, Steve hung up and called both Sydney and Brenda over and over again between 12:52 and 12:53 p.m., but got no answer. He was very concerned at this point and had no idea what type of incident could have happened. Before he could leave work to run back home, he gets a call from Sydney. Just a minute later at 12:54, and she calmly lets him know that Brenda's still on the phone with Mount Union. But now Steve's confused. Why would there be a call over the radio and police on their way over to his house if everything was okay? That's when he informed Sydney that law enforcement was en route. And it was like a total 180. Sydney became hysterical. She's screaming, she's sobbing. There's a bunch of noise and commotion in the background. And she tells her dad that someone was breaking into their house. Steve hangs up and calls Ken back right away. And he says, "This is legit. Something's going on in my house. There's been a break-in." But the thing is, this timeline is off. If police were already on their way before Steve spoke to Sydney, why would she just announce to her father that someone was breaking in? She just told him that Brenda was on the phone with Mount Union, as though everything was fine. Well, it's because she was found out. Someone had called the police, because indeed, something was going on at that house. Officers were now on their way to conduct a welfare check. Whenever we have available body cam footage or trial footage, we like to include some of that to give you context. And one of my friends, Paula, over at Plunder, was nice enough to allow me to use the footage I'm about to show you that she got through a FOIA request. So I want to thank her, and I'm going to link her channel below. She does a lot of current cases if you're into that kind of thing. But this is important to see for yourself, because I think the context of what happened when police arrived is very important. I want to warn you about something and just note that this body cam footage, we did not blur it. The police department did that because this was a very graphic scene. It's also going to be chaotic for you to listen to everything that happened when the first officer arrived. He comes to the door and right away he hears a scream in the distance coming from inside the house. Even though I'm about to play this for you, I do describe these things because some people are only listening. Sydney opens the door and she's frantic. She's wearing an oversized navy blue sweatshirt and black leggings with white socks that are covered in blood. There's also blood all over her hands and on the sleeves of her sweatshirt. It's clear that something horrific has occurred. Sydney can hardly form a sentence. She's screaming that her mother's on the floor inside. Let's play that clip for you now.
Wait, she's on the ground. So there's...
Who is it?
My mom! Someone broke in the back window.
All right, hold on.
And she's on the ground. And
Hold on. Where's your mom? Okay, stay right here.
No, there's so much blood. No, please.
Man.
She's in the court now. No.
Stop. Hold on, we gotta figure out what's going on.
1300.
Can you sit down? Can you sit down?
Oh, nice. Get that 32 roll real quick. We got a female down.
Start this morning.
Correct.
Take her outside. Come on. Come on.
Is she gonna be okay?
Come on.
Come on.
Come on. You just need to cooperate with me, all right?
I want my dad.
Huh?
I want my dad.
What happened? What's going on? What's going on?
We heard a bang. We heard a bang. And she told me to get out. And then I heard screaming. So I came back and she was on the ground.
Okay, you heard a
I ran
bang.
out back. There was a bang. Someone broke in.
Okay. What is your name?
Sydney?
Are you cut?
I don't think so.
Yeah, you're cut somewhere.
I don't think so.
Yeah, your hand.
No, I was helping her. I grabbed her.
All right, stop. I'll tell you what, can you sit on the ground here real quick?
Tuna dispatch.
Come on. Come on.
You said the ground.
Yeah, you're fine right there.
No.
You're fine right there.
Make a call, please. 76
I grabbed the knife.
just before the Britain Street exit ramp. A truck lost some concrete.
This is minor. They might have a more, I don't know. Check that victim in there. She's got cuts on her hands. I don't know what they have in there, but there's a female down in there. Yeah.
What's going on?
I don't know. We just got
dad. I'm the dad.
That is one of the most terrifying and just anxiety-inducing videos I've seen in a while. She's just frantic and almost pushing the police officer out of the way, saying, no, there's just so much blood. Like she doesn't want him to come through. And you may have caught her telling him that someone broke in and she's directing him to the back of the house. All the while, the cop is just, calm down, stop it. We have to understand what's going on here. Then they basically decide to take Sydney outside. They can't tell if she's a victim that's just grieving an attack on her own mother or what, but she's not helping the situation. As she's being taken outside, you hear her ask repeatedly if her mom's going to be okay.
The officer has completely had it with her. He's dragging her out of the house and asks what happened. And through her sobs, Sydney starts asking for her dad. She says that she and her mom heard a bang and her mom told her to get out. Then she heard screaming, ran back, and saw her mom on the ground bleeding out. That's when she noticed that someone had broken in through the window in their living room.
But oddly, Sydney has cuts on her hands and they're bleeding. The officer points this out, saying, "You're cut." And Sydney whines over and over again, "I don't think so." And she's insisting that she was helping her mom and that the blood was from grabbing onto Brenda. Then she eerily states that she grabbed the knife. I'm thinking she's saying this to imply that her prints would be on it because she's helping. Of course, she had nothing to do with this. That's a lot of forward thinking here and already lots of planning in such a short time frame. In the time between the call to 911 and the cops arriving, she's already got a story about a break-in. For the next minute or two, Sydney acts disoriented and confused. She's screaming and sobbing and sitting on the ground in front of the driveway while the officers talk about the victim inside. Sydney cries louder when they mention her mom being down inside of the house. She may have seen her dad pull up because what you don't see from this angle is that her dad is walking up during the time that she's sobbing out of nowhere and screaming. And as soon as he enters the frame, he says, "What's going on? I'm her dad." And at this point, she's like frantically and hysterically crying. I mean, it was like a switch went off. She put on the waterworks when he walked up.
It seemed pretty obvious that she's putting a show on for her father.
That's what it looked like to me as well. And wait until you see this next part. Steve is asking, where is his wife? And Sydney is screaming that the window is broken. And she's like, "Daddy!" Like she is the victim here and had just watched her mom being attacked. Now, I want to note, if she was truly the victim and had just watched her mom being attacked, I would never say the things I'm saying right now, but we've already told you that she killed her mom. So all of this is important to showcase because of what's going to happen when she gets to court and the argument her defense attorneys are going to make. And that's why we're going to be pointing things out to you. Poor Steve. He's like aimlessly walking in circles. He has no idea what's going on. He doesn't know what condition his wife is in. Nobody's giving him any answers. There's cop cars up and down this street. This is a very small neighborhood. No one is used to seeing anything like this, and Sydney won't talk. The officer's asking her again and again, "What's your name? What's your birthday? How old are you?" Just simple questions, and she's just sobbing and then silent. She'll answer something here and there, but she's not cooperative, even to the point where an officer has to kind of like shake her, and still nothing. An ambulance then pulls up. There's a stretcher coming out of it, and they're now inside the house assessing what's going on with Brenda.
I don't know. We just
I'm
got
the dad. I'm the dad.
Okay,
Sydney. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Daddy!
What? What the hell? Where's my wife?
The window's broken, Dad!
Where?
The back window's broken in!
So you're going to have to...
Daddy!
There's officers inside there, so...
You okay?
I don't know! There
Go
was
check
so
the
much
lady in the
blood!
house, okay? She's got minor cuts here, so... It's pretty bad up there. What's your name, ma'am? Sorry, what's your name again? She's got cuts on her hands.
Okay.
So.
Got cuts on her hand.
Yeah.
Take care of her.
Dave, I think this is. Are you dad?
Yeah, I'm the dad.
Can you stay here with them?
We have another. I'll call for another med unit for her.
Somebody has my wife.
12.
12.
Can you start another med unit on here? We have a female constantly breathing, cuts to her hands.
Got me.
You said your name's Sydney? Ma'am, is your name Sydney? What's your last name?
Jeep's probably.
No, he's in Talmadge. Yes, I talked to him.
What is it? Powell. What's your date of birth? Huh?
Yeah.
What's your date of birth?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have another one
no.
coming.
No, but somebody's got to take.
I have another med unit coming.
All right. You got some gloves? I got some.
Right here.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I thought the other one. I mean, she just got cuts to her hands here.
Oh, it's just a cut.
Yeah. So I don't know.
There were 2 more officers inside when the one we showed you was grabbing Sydney and removing her from the house.
The other officers were still inside assessing the situation after Sydney was removed, which was before the ambulance arrived. In the next clip, you'll see the officers talking about what they've observed. They mention Brenda saying she's a 22 and likely won't make it. They note what appear to be fatal injuries, including a slash to her neck. She was found face up on the floor of a bedroom in a massive pool of blood that had started seeping through the floors into the basement. Of course, the footage is completely blurred. Another officer points out that a window in the back of the house is broken, and he suspects Sydney walked in on her mother being attacked.
There was one heartbreaking moment when Steve came through that front door and he was yelling Brenda's name over and over again. And an officer tells him he needs to stand back and go back outside. And he's like, no, I don't. And once the EMTs arrive, one of the officers tells them there's a big knife on the floor, as well as a big frying pan with blood on it, and that Brenda doesn't look like she has any signs of life in her.
I would put that out. Medics get here. Secure the scene. She looks like a 22. She looks like she's been down for a while. There's blood all over the place. There's a knife by her head and stuff like that, and there's a huge pool of blood. 43 or... No, I think she just walked in on it. There's a broken window in the back. So if you can just put up some crime scene tape. As soon as AFD gets here, they're going to pronounce her, I'm sure. Sam, you want to check her? I don't think she'll breathe.
You want me to secure it from the outside?
Back here.
One none. It looks like she's gonna be a 22 with a slash to her throat. We're good. Come on in. Stand back. Stay back.
You need to go outside, sir.
No, I don't.
Yes, you do. Outside. Back to the
Fellas, it looks like 22. Throat slashed. Yeah. There's a big knife right there. Don't think so. Big old frying pan.
11.
You want me to take that knife out of there for you guys?
Can I move it?
She's got that nice little throat laceration right there. There is a knife by her shoulder, just so you know.
Who did this?
We don't know.
One EMT even remarked at the end of that clip, "Who did this?" And the officer says, "We don't know." This was probably one of the biggest cases that a lot of these cops had ever worked on. I mean, this is not a busy, bustling city with a lot of crime. So it's shocking. I mean, it would be for anyone, but especially this woman is lying there in this huge pool of blood. They can't even show this without blurring the entire footage, with a frying pan and a large knife just sitting there. And they're thinking that her daughter witnessed her being essentially murdered. Sydney is now lying motionless in the front of the house by the street, not speaking.
There are a lot of officers at the scene. Some are putting up yellow police tape to cordon off the perimeter, while Steve stands there looking confused, wondering why his wife still hasn't come out of the house.
And that made me sad because he was probably thinking positively at first, like maybe she's being interviewed, maybe she's being checked out. But she was on the brink of death, and they couldn't bring her out in such a bad condition right in front of her husband, and that is so tough.
Some officers were going around the neighborhoods to see if anyone had heard or seen anything unusual, while a couple of others were examining the back of the house. The backyard has a concrete slab with a small brick fire pit, but not much else. No chairs, no tables, just grass and a shed. One of the sliding glass doors is open, with the vertical blind sticking out a bit and shattered glass scattered around the area. Sydney is finally lifted from the ground where she had been lying in the fetal position and placed on a gurney. She's taken to the hospital, and based on her condition, the cops believed she's severely traumatized. An officer is sent with her to the hospital to question her once she's stabilized. Meanwhile, 2 other officers move Steve out of sight and into a squad car, as they need to transport Brenda from the house to one of the ambulances waiting outside.
It's starting to rain. The sky has turned gray. And once EMTs get Brenda out of the house and inside the ambulance, they are huddled inside trying to perform life-saving measures on her as they rush her to Cleveland Clinic, Akron General. But it's not looking good at all. As they wiped the blood from her face, they could see brain matter coming from her head wounds. She only had a very faint pulse, and a machine was breathing for her. She had multiple stab and slice wounds to her body, stab wounds all over her face, and obvious blunt force trauma to the top left of her head. While on this ride, we find out who called 911. Let's listen to the officer explain this to the EMTs.
Came in from Mount Union College. She was talking to Mount Union, and they heard a fight break out and phone disconnect. They called back multiple times, somebody picked up, they heard her screaming again, so then they just called the chief's office, which is how we got there to check the welfare, not realizing we had this going on. So, I know daughter's cut up, but I'm not sure from what.
Well, we got a call for Mrs. Police, and it said step up, and had nothing else.
Yeah, my note screen is blank. I called Sergeant Null, who got the call in the chief's office on the way there just to find out what we had. We didn't have anybody. We didn't have a name.
Do we still not have a name?
This is Brenda. I have both people's names now. This is Brenda Powell.
Brenda Powell?
Powell.
The officer was talking really fast, and there was a lot happening in the background, but he explained that the 911 call came from Mount Union College. Apparently, Brenda was on the phone with someone from the school, and during the call, they heard a fight break out before the line disconnected. They tried calling Brenda back multiple times, but no one answered. Eventually, someone did pick up, but they heard screaming and immediately hung up to call the local Akron Police Department. Even though the college is in Alliance, Ohio, they figured Akron Police would respond faster since the Powells lived there. The officers were given very little information. They thought they were just doing a routine welfare check, not responding to a brutal attack. The officer also mentioned that Sydney had been cut up too, but wasn't sure how.
I wonder. Maybe it was the knife that she used. No one knew what was going on. They had to piece everything together. Back at the house, they were investigating that back door. The slider's open, the blinds are hanging there, and to the right of that area on the side of the home is a window that is smashed. There's glass outside on the ground and on the windowsill, and you can see the small horizontal corded aluminum blinds look like someone grabbed them and tangled them up. There's blood on a few of them, but it's on the outside of the blinds. I wonder whose blood that is, and why the killer would have blood on them before they smashed the window.
The officer came in through the sliding door, pushing the blinds aside as he stepped in, and right away he noticed a couch that had been pushed over from behind, so it's now lying on its front, with the bottom exposed. To the right of the couch was a small card table holding a partially completed Disney Snow White puzzle. In the front of the area was a broken window with shattered glass covering the console table below it and scattered on the carpet.
And I wonder if Sydney's hand was cut from smashing in that window now that I'm seeing this, because she'd like you to believe it was the killer that broke that window and somehow went through that tiny hole to get inside and then escaped through the sliding door. But really, she went through the sliding door outside and then smashed in that window after she realized that the cops were on the way. I mean, if you look closely, there are drops of blood on the vertical cloth blinds that are hanging from that sliding glass door. It's a subtle clue, but it's an important one. Granted, if there was a third person, they could have transferred Brenda's blood there while escaping, but this isn't a case of whodunit. And we'll get to that later. But it's interesting to see this play out, especially because in this next clip, as the officer is examining the broken window and the backside of the home, he's learning more of the context over the radio. So let's listen to that now. And bear in mind, the officer over the radio incorrectly stated that it was a representative from Malone College that was speaking with Brenda, but it's actually Mount Union. His mistake.
What it sounds like, Noel was on the phone with a rep from Malone. Anyway, they were on the phone with the older of these two. This is a mom and daughter, apparently. Said in the middle of their conversation, they just heard a terrible fight, and then the line went dead. According to him, someone answered the phone that was saying they were Brenda, but it was not. He said he could tell it was female. But it wasn't Brenda. He was on the phone speaking with Brenda, who was the mom.
Why would the attacker get on the phone and pretend they are Brenda?
Exactly. I think they were aware at this point that something wasn't adding up. And I'm sure the college was giving them context about how Sydney was dismissed, she was staying on campus for months, and that her parents didn't know. But guess what? We won't have to guess because all of those people are going to be interviewed, and you'll soon find out exactly what they heard on that phone call. Something that they're never going to be able to get out of their minds. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so I want to tell you about the cop that was listening to that radio. He took his body cam off of his chest, you know how it usually stays stationary, and he began using it to scan the area. So he's recording blood on the ground, on the handle of the sliding door, as well as on the screen. It was raining, so all of this could have been washed away. It's a really good thing he documented that. The next day, they spoke to Michelle Gaffney and Dean John Fraser, the two people who were on a conference call with Brenda when they heard the commotion and called 911. That morning on March 3rd, Steve and Brenda had both called the school. Steve was asking about the tuition, and Brenda left a message for someone to call her back in regard to her daughter not being enrolled. So the deans got on speakerphone from the office, and they called Brenda back. Let's listen to Michelle explain what happened.
We went in his office and called the number on the phone message that we were given, and Dean Fraser was sitting at his desk and I was sitting next to it. He dialed, the phone was answered, and Mrs. Powell answered.
You say Mrs. Powell, is that Brenda who answered?
Brenda answered, yes.
Okay. And what did you tell Brenda at that time?
So Dean Fraser was speaking and simply said, Brenda, this is Dean Fraser. I'm sitting here with Michelle Gaffney, our associate dean of students. We're returning your call, and that's about as far as we got.
Did Brenda respond to that introduction at all?
Yeah.
Okay,
yes.
What did she say?
I think he asked, "Is this Brenda Powell?"
Oh, okay.
And she said yes, and then he identified himself.
Okay. And Miss Gaffney, what happened next?
There was a very large or a very loud sort of thud sound, like a pounding or a thud, accompanied by a pretty loud scream, and the scream might have actually been first, and then the thud.
Okay.
As I think about it, and then there was sort of an expulsion. The other sound that I heard at that same time, or right after, was sort of an expulsion of air, like the air was knocked out of somebody.
Okay.
I'd always heard that expression of the air being knocked, having the wind knocked out of you, but I didn't. That's actually what it sounded like. And then several more repeated thuds. I don't know how to describe the sound.
No, and that's okay. And you and Mr. Frazier could hear this from the other end of the phone.
From the other, it was on speakerphone, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you hear any communication during these thuds?
Just the screaming, and so we were both talking into the phone, saying, what's happening? Are you okay? Do you need help? What's going on?
Yeah, can you describe your mindset at this time?
I mean, I very definitely felt like someone was being attacked. And so we weren't getting an answer. I think at some point I said, if you can't respond, we're going to call the police. If we don't hear if no one can tell us what's going on. The dean's has an administrative assistant right outside his door. So I said, well, I'm going to get Sydney's address. And he kept talking. And so,
Mr. Frazier?
Mr. Frazier, yeah, Dean Frazier. So I opened the door and told our admin, I said, I need Sydney Powell's address right away.
So you wanted to get directly in contact with...
I knew she was from Akron. I wanted to get directly to the Akron police, so...
And Ms. Gaffney, can you describe how that phone call continued or what happened next?
So while Tara is our assistant, while Tara was looking up that address, the phone cut off at some point after, I would say that somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 of those thuddings, those sort of thud sounds. And the screaming had continued.
And when you say the phone cut off, did the call drop or
the
was
call
it
dropped?
Okay.
We lost the call.
Okay.
And so we decided to keep, while we were waiting for the address, to keep calling. We called the number back.
Brenda's number?
Brenda's number that she'd left. And we called twice, and there was no answer. It rang and rang and rang and no answer. When it went to voicemail, we hung up and we called again. And then on the third time, and I had just gotten the address as the phone was answered.
Okay.
On the third try to the number, and Dean Frazier said something along the lines of, "Brenda, is that you? Are you there?" And the voice on the other end said, "Yes, this is Brenda." Yes, this is Brenda.
Now, Ms. Gaffney, did you recognize that voice on the line?
Yeah.
Okay. Was that Brenda Powell?
It was not Brenda.
Who did you recognize that voice to be?
I was sure it was Sydney. Both Dean Frazier and I looked at each other and sort of shook our heads at each other and said, "That's not Brenda." And he then said, "I don't, Sydney. I think this is you. This is not Brenda."
And what happened next?
The phone went dead.
Okay. And Ms. Gaffney, what did you do next?
We called the Akron police.
Clearly they knew this wasn't someone that had broken in, because Sydney answered the phone pretending to be her mom just minutes after they heard thuds and screams. How scary is that? They were ear witnesses to Brenda being fatally attacked, because sadly, Brenda didn't make it. She passed away shortly after getting to the hospital. And Sydney Powell, who had yet to speak to anyone regarding the events that day, was released from the hospital the very next day on Wednesday, March 4th. But she was taken right to the Summit County Jail on suspicion of homicide. According to the medical examiner, Brenda Powell died from multiple sharp and blunt force injuries. And it was later determined by testing the items at the scene that had Brenda's blood on them that she had been hit with a cast iron skillet repeatedly. That before Brenda could figure out from the Deans what was going on and that Sydney's lies would be uncovered, Sydney ran and grabbed the first thing she could find, and it was that skillet. The Deans heard this happening.
Then, when she realized what she had done, or maybe it was after her dad told her the cops were coming, she grabbed a steak knife and stabbed her mother at least 23 times in the face and neck. After that, she ran outside through the sliding glass doors, covered in Brenda's blood, smashed in that side window, and tried to make it look like an attacker was responsible. The cuts on Sydney's hands were from smashing that window.
A cell phone, a skillet, and the knife was found next to Brenda's body. An emergency psychiatric evaluation was ordered for Sydney since she was acting catatonic following this event. And I want to emphasize following this event because her actions before and after were very different, and that matters. She was eventually charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count each of felonious assault, which means causing serious bodily injury with the use of a deadly weapon. And lastly, she was charged with tampering with evidence. At her first hearing, she, through her attorneys, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity.
But before this plea, she had told a completely different story. Ever since she was admitted to the hospital, she kept telling countless doctors and psychiatrists the same thing, that she was down in the basement while her mom was on the phone with the school. Then she heard glass break, blacked out, and the next thing she remembered was waking up to see a knife in her mother's throat, trying to stop the bleeding.
Right. More lies because they know the evidence doesn't match. So her defense comes up with this new theory that she was insane when she killed her mom. However, like I said, how she was acting before the killing, during, and even shortly afterward versus how she acted following her claim of insanity are stark in comparison. Sydney's trial on September 7th, 2023 was 3 years after Brenda's death. The prosecution was clear. This wasn't a case of whodunit. Rather, it was a case of whether or not the person who did it was aware of the wrongfulness of her actions while she was committing the acts. The prosecution contended that Sydney's actions were to cover up a series of lies. Let's listen to that part of the opening statement now.
Stephen and Brenda, they start to notice something. They start to kind of push on Sydney. They notice that she's home during the afternoons more here in Akron when she should be in class. And they try to confront Sydney. But rather than receiving answers, once again they receive lies. Sydney, why are you home during the day? Oh, class was canceled. Oh, I have an excuse to not appear in class. Stephen Powell recognizes that his tuition that he pays to Mount Union still hasn't been withdrawn. Sydney, what's going on with the tuition? Don't worry, Dad. I'll get it handled on Monday. Still hiding the fact that she's not a student there at this time. Now, the state isn't going to pretend we don't understand that stress. Every human being has been in a position where lies are a little bit heavy, and you don't want to confront what's really going on, especially to your parents. And for an individual at Sydney's age, at Miss Powell's position in life, college can be a little bit overwhelming. We're not ignoring that. We're not ignoring the anxieties and the stress that comes with that. But these lies were built and controlled by Miss Powell. They were built upon each other, protecting herself and hiding her reality. And during the week of February 24th, after she's left campus, she knows she can't return home because spring break doesn't start until March 3rd. And so Miss Powell starts to continue to visit campus, staying with friends, staying at local hotels. But what she's doing is not returning home, because she'd have to confront the reality that things were not as perfect as she told her parents.
Does that sound like an insane person? Someone that can come up with lie after lie after lie and keep perpetuating the story that they're in school? That to me does not sound like an insane person. It sounds like a calculated person. And records showed that Sydney never saw a counselor. She never told her mother or her father of any concerns about her mental health. Now, that doesn't automatically mean she wasn't suffering from any mental health conditions, but it would have been helpful to her defense if there had been a record.
The prosecutor explained that the night before Sydney killed her mother, she went out and hung out with her former sorority sisters. When Lauren was interviewed about how Sydney was acting that night, she told investigators that Sydney seemed like her normal, social, charismatic, bubbly self. Lauren didn't think there was anything wrong with her. She didn't appear to be having any sort of break with reality or showing any signs of being in a state of psychosis.
Right. And this was her best friend for over 6 years. They had lived together, and she even added that she never noticed Sydney having trouble sleeping, hallucinating, or having blackouts of any kind. Though there was this one time that she got so drunk at a party, she had to call her mother at the hospital to come get her because she was sick and worried about being so wasted, basically. Her mom raced over and made sure that everything was okay. However, Lauren did admit that Sydney had experienced anxiety during her high school years and that she had been under even more stress starting college. Yet the defense is going to claim that Sydney indeed had a break from reality, and that leading up to the week she killed her mother, she was devolving. And to excuse the lying, they would argue it was disorganized thinking. When a defendant claims insanity, it's a little bit different than the normal back and forth in court that usually happens at a trial. Usually the prosecution has the burden the whole way through to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crime. That's still the same in this case. But then the burden switches to the defense, which doesn't usually happen. Typically, the defense doesn't have to prove anything. But when you claim insanity, they have to prove that. They have to prove it was more likely than not that she was suffering from a mental defect and that she didn't know the wrongfulness of her actions at the time of the killing. That's very important. Let's listen to the prosecution explain why he doesn't think that's the case with Sydney.
So what you're going to be left with is the sole core question of this case. And I'll remind you again, the law does not come from me. It does not come from this PowerPoint. You'll be instructed on the law, and that's important to remember. The law comes from the court. And you will be left to decide whether or not Ms. Powell was suffering from a serious mental disease that wouldn't allow her to know the wrongfulness of her actions that day. Now, this is a very unique legal scenario, legal case, where the burden is actually going to shift. And the state owns the burden to first present the case. We need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and we hold that burden strongly. We have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Ms. Powell committed these offenses. And after that, that burden is going to shift to the defense in a very unique situation. Now, the defense is going to have the burden to prove that Ms. Powell was suffering from a severe mental disease and she did not know the wrongfulness of her actions at the time of the murder. Now, you're going to hear testimony about her mental health after this incident. And it's important to remember, of course you can consider that. I'm not going to tell you not to. But what I am going to ask you to do is to remember that the law is during the period of the offenses. What was her mental state then? And that burden, it's a lot different than the state's. Although the state has to prove that burden beyond a reasonable doubt, that's not on the defense. Instead, the defense has to prove this by a preponderance of the evidence, which is more likely than not. That's the defense burden. And the state isn't going to sit here and pretend that anxiety was not a factor, that her stress of school wasn't a factor, that the stress of lying wasn't a factor. But the state believes that if you follow the evidence, it did not lead to this. To her not knowing the wrongfulness of her actions because of the disease.
The defense attorney began his opening statements by telling the jury that the prosecution could talk all they wanted to about what happened on March 3rd, 2020, but it would never explain the reasons behind Sydney's actions. But why? Because her actions weren't reasonable. He went on to say that not only was Sydney having a psychotic break, but she was also suffering from schizophrenia. He explained that the jury would hear from experts who have since diagnosed Sydney with the mental disorder.
And I'm sure most of us have heard of schizophrenia, but not everyone really knows what it is. And it is a disorder, and it affects how a person thinks, feels, and behaves. It's categorized by disruptions in thought processes, perceptions, and emotional responsiveness, and also social interactions. In other words, individuals suffering from schizophrenia can act as though they've lost touch with reality. They can be hard to reason with, hard to understand, and even hard to hang out with like they were before, which is very sad. Young adults typically begin showing signs of schizophrenia in their late teens into their early 30s, with the most common onset being in the late teens to mid-20s. Symptoms of schizophrenia can sometimes appear gradually, making it challenging to recognize early on. Early signs might include subtle changes in thinking, mood, or social behaviors. More obvious symptoms include hallucinations and disorganized thinking. There's that word again. That's why they're using it. So you can see where the defense was going with this. Sydney was only 19 when all of this occurred. Maybe the symptoms were coming on subtly. Maybe people didn't notice that her anxiety was really her disorganized thinking, and then she had a full-blown psychotic break.
The defense told the jury that the reasons behind Sydney's actions were the most important part of the trial because of her diagnosis. But before diving deeper into the why of the case, he wanted to talk about who the Powells were. While he spoke about how extraordinary Brenda was, Sydney sat at the defense table crying into her hands. Several times she closed her eyes tightly and covered her ears, trying to block out the details of her own words and actions. He stated that Brenda was Sydney's best friend. So what led her to kill her own mother?
You're going to hear from some of the folks who saw Sydney and Brenda interact together. And what you're going to hear is they were super close. Sydney was like Brenda's mini-me. And Brenda was Sydney's best friend. And on Tuesday, March 3rd, 2020, Sydney killed her best friend, her mother. Why? Why did that happen? We're going to spend next week bringing you answers to that sole core question. I submit to you the only question in this case, which is why.
The defense went on to explain that various mental health expert witnesses would testify that at the time of Brenda's murder, Sydney was suffering from a severe mental illness, schizophrenia. They would explain how her condition prevented her from understanding the wrongfulness of her actions. While there were no outward signs of her illness, she was allegedly suffering in silence from auditory and visual hallucinations. She heard voices telling her she was worthless and unloved. The defense based this on things Sydney had shared about herself, including that she started hearing voices when she was just 10 or 11.
They're going to talk to you about how schizophrenia manifests itself in late teens and early 20s. That's when this is common. You're going to hear that Cindy was reporting before March of 2020 audio and visual hallucinations. She was hearing voices. You're not worth anything. You're worthless. People know it. You're a failure. Those were the voices. She was seeing things, cartoon figures, looking like fire was coming out of her hands. She's going to talk about these, the doctors are going to talk about, and the records are going to show these delusions of reference, meaning Sydney believed that everyone was talking about her. Miss Mulligan, the teacher from St. V, is going to come in and talk to you about an episode, a specific episode when Sydney was in her junior year at St. V. This is when she had a 3.8 grade point average, doing extremely well. She had a project. And you'll see when stress is placed upon Sydney or anyone with a serious and severe mental disease, bad things happen. When Sydney had to give this project, all of a sudden she kind of froze, and she tells Miss Mulligan, I couldn't read the numbers. A friend of Sydney's takes her to their favorite teacher, Miss Mulligan, and they talk. And Miss Mulligan, the teacher, will tell you that Sydney was really confused, was distraught, was upset. I had never seen her like this, and it was what we would all now probably call a panic attack.
So she was suffering from panic attacks because she didn't understand her schoolwork in high school, and they're trying to argue that this was schizophrenia being missed by the people around her. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but these were things that Sydney self-reported after she's being charged with murder. I mean, I think each one of us after the fact could argue by looking backwards in our life that any weird situation we were in or experiencing correlates. For example, when I was in college, I could not pass public speaking no matter how many times I tried. I failed it. I withdrew from it time and time again. And this all had to do with one time when I went up to speak, I lost my voice. It just wouldn't come out. And so I wasn't suffering from any kind of like mental defect. It was just the nervousness, the overwhelming part of college. And I guess I was having maybe a panic attack at the time. It was humiliating and terrifying for me. But does this mean that just because she was experiencing a panic attack and her teacher reported that back in high school, that she had some kind of disorder that wouldn't allow her to know right from wrong? Because that's a distinction. Sure, she could have been having anxiety, depression, a lot of mental health conditions, but would that prevent her from knowing what she was doing? Well, the prosecution doesn't think so. And they argue later that she's not a reliable source of information about her own mental health, that she is what they refer to as malingering, meaning that she was faking it, especially because even though it's technically possible to hear voices as young as the defense said when Sydney was 10, it would be considered extremely rare. Usually, early onset schizophrenia doesn't manifest before the age of 13. Instead, children who are genuinely experiencing auditory hallucinations do so because of severe anxiety, depression, or trauma-related disorders. So how was the defense going to counter that when we know that Sydney grew up in a loving, supportive household? Well, sports. That's right. She was injured while playing soccer and had at least 2 concussions, which could have impacted her brain and had a detrimental effect on Sydney's mental health. But remember, She graduated with a high GPA. Her teachers had very positive things to say about her. They even had other students looking towards Sydney as a role model.
The defense argued that even though Sydney had always been a great student, her undiagnosed mental illness started affecting her grades a lot. She couldn't sleep at night because of hallucinations, so she'd sleep all day and miss her classes. After her first year of college, her GPA dropped to 2.2. Putting her on academic probation unless she improved her grades. But her mental health issues made it impossible for her to keep it up, and her GPA fell below 2.0, leading her to dismissal. The defense also told the jury that Sydney was in such a deep depressive denial that she went back to school as if nothing had happened. They said it wasn't just a lie, it was her living in false reality caused by her mental illness.
This is more than a lie. This is a false reality. This is Sydney creating a world where everything is okay. I mean, how can you imagine going back to the university when you've been expelled? You know you can't be there. But she still says that. She shows up in January of 20, and her name's not on the door. Her key card's not working. She can't get food in the cafeteria. She's not in any classes. But she's created this fake reality, this false alternative reality that everything's okay. She's strapping on her backpack and pretending to walk to class. She's hiding out in the student center, the study room, waiting for her friends to come back. She's pretending to study. And the voices are getting louder. And her symptoms are growing stronger. She's sleeping more. She's isolating. She isn't going out. And she is not dealing with reality.
I agree with him on the last sentence. She was not dealing with reality. That's exactly right.
They told the jury that Sydney's paranoia felt like living in constant terror and heightened fear. They explained that after her mother's death, police found her in a catatonic state, which is a reaction to extreme psychological shock and trauma, often worsened by an underlying psychotic disorder. This kind of condition needs immediate medical and psychiatric care. After Brenda's murder, Sydney was taken to the hospital where she was diagnosed with a psychotic break, possibly linked to schizophrenia. She was then sent to a facility for acute psychiatric care and stayed there for 9 days.
Well, I'm sure if you just killed your own mother, regardless of the reason, that you would be in a catatonic state, knowing that you're going to jail. And sure, you would have PTSD, but that's afterward. But here's the defense explaining his version.
And she's taken from the scene to Akron City Hospital. And at Akron City Hospital, she spends March 3rd and March 4th there. And you will hear and see from Detective Bertina King, who tries to go and make sense of this. At this point, law enforcement doesn't know. Is she a victim? Is she a suspect? What's going on? And Sydney is completely catatonic. She's mumbling to herself, "Get out, get out, get out." So what do the professionals at Akron City Hospital say on March 3rd and March 4th, within an hour and 24 hours of this incident? They say that she is incoherent, she's placed in protective isolation for psychiatric concerns. She is showing psychiatric symptoms of catatonia, and Dr. Ivan, who evaluates her, says, and you'll have these records, there is a concern for acute psychosis as a result of schizophrenia, concerns also for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's not our experts. That's the hospital that's saying this within hours of Sydney arriving there. On March 4th, Sydney was charged, and she was discharged from Akron City Hospital. She was then transported to the Summit County Jail and was there March 5th and March 6th. On March 6th, she's released after Stephen Powell posted her bond. And there are mental health professionals at the Summit County Jail who look at her and evaluate her. And what they say is, if this client is released from jail, she is to be involuntarily hospitalized. Sydney's released on March 6th. She goes from the Summit County Jail to Portage Path Emergency Services, PES, P-P-E-S, Portage Path Emergency Services. And they see her for a day and a half, maybe 2 days, and they recommend inpatient psychiatric hospitalization. You can't go home. You have to go to an inpatient, involuntary psychiatric hospital, and that's what Sydney does. She goes from Portage Path to Akron General Cleveland Clinic, and she spends the next 9 days in the psychiatric hospital there. So for 9 days, there are experts whose only job, whose only motivation is to help the people in that institution who evaluate her. They talk to her, and they perform the tests that are recognized in the field of psychology to answer the question why. And what happens is, based on that testing, the observation, they come up with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And they also say we're going to have to rule out possible epilepsy, because there's this thing with the concussions. There's concern that maybe this was a seizure. What's going on? Let's answer the question why. So Sydney goes to University Hospital in June and July of 2020, and you'll have those records. And she's undergone a whole battery of tests over about 6 days. They do an MRI, they do an fMRI, and you'll hear about what all those tests tell us. And the result is, it wasn't a seizure. The only explanation for what happened is a psychological breakdown, schizophrenia.
The only explanation, sir? No. I can't get on board with that being the only explanation because there are so many other possibilities to explore. However, again, according to the defense, as soon as Sydney was properly diagnosed with schizophrenia, she began a combination of medications, including antipsychotics and mood stabilizers. They worked so well, she was to the point where she was ready to be released. The decision was made that she shouldn't go back to the house where she had killed her mother. That space could be triggering, as Sydney was now also suffering, like I said, from PTSD from her mother's murder, obviously. Even though she was the one who did the killing. Being in that environment could be a major setback, so get this. Brenda's own mother, Sydney's grandmother, who lived out on a small farm, not only forgave her granddaughter for what she had done, but she welcomed Sydney into her home because she said that she knew Brenda would have forgiven Sydney. And I mean no disrespect because this is Brenda's mother. But with all due respect, speaking for someone who is not here to speak for themselves, even if you are their loved one, in a case like this where they have been brutally murdered, I think that's unfair because I don't think Brenda wanted to die. And she was robbed of the opportunity to tell us what it felt like in that moment. But this may or may not surprise you. Sydney's grandmother wasn't the only person in her family that forgave her for what she did to her mother. Stephen Powell, Sydney's own father, not only forgave her, but supported her. He was on her side, even though she killed the love of his life. This kind of made my head spin because although I acknowledge that this is a very, very emotional and complicated situation, I don't think that I could be that forgiving.
I don't think so.
But it's hard. Because you're like, well, that's my daughter and I think of Mazzy. I mean, I don't want you to think of her like hurting me and I don't want anyone to think of that about their own family members, but we kind of have to. That's why we analyze these cases. It's like putting yourself in those shoes and saying, could I forgive my child if they killed my partner?
I think one would forgive somebody, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't go through, the processes and the repercussions for their actions.
But then again, you lost your wife and now you're going to lose your kid too.
I know.
It's very hard.
Steve testified that Sydney was a kind, loving, athletic, and smart girl who had a very close relationship with her mother. He said that their bond was unbreakable and that Sydney had never been violent before.
What was so sad for me was watching him break down when he was asked whether he left the house after Brenda was on her way home. And he did. And that guilt was something that was very overwhelming because I said this earlier. If he would have been there, maybe this wouldn't have happened. During the trial, the forensic pathologist explained how violent this attack really was. Brenda suffered at least 23 stab wounds, mainly to her neck and the back of her head, which caused the skin on her scalp to be broken. Pictures were shown to the jury that depicted defensive wounds to her face, her arms, and her hands, as she struggled to protect herself by moving her head back and forth, trying to get up, putting her arms in front of her face. And that's hard to hear knowing that her daughter did this to her. Now, to counter the argument by the defense that Sydney was suffering from a mental defect, the lead detective Whitten testified that evidence he found showed that all of her interactions in the days, weeks, and months leading up to the murder, other than her failing grades, were normal. She interacted with her peers, she lied, she planned her deception, and she even had the presence of mind to stage the scene, which was another indication that she was feigning mental health issues.
However, during cross-examination by the defense, The detective agreed that right after the police arrived, Sydney was erratic, hysterical, and catatonic. She was on the ground in the fetal position and seemed unable to respond to any questions.
Yeah, and it's true. A lot of criminals don't have the ability to shut up and not incriminate themselves. We see that in so many of these cases, but in this case, because she didn't say anything, now she's suffering from a mental illness when she could have just known that in the moment, like, I'm going to go to jail, I'm going to get in trouble. So she knew not to talk. I mean, she had to have known she was going to get in trouble. That's why she spent time staging the scene. So why not continue to be silent? Now, I'm not saying it would be boring to go through all of what the doctor said, but it is very dense information. It's all the medical, psychological things that they did, the testings and all their analysis. It was different psychiatrists and psychologists who tested her. But I just want to give you the rundown on their findings according to the defense. First, there was Dr. James Reardon, who evaluated Sydney in the fall of 2021 and diagnosed her with schizophrenia and major depressive disorder. He told the jury that Sydney doesn't remember the attack. Her last memory of her mother was that they were sitting on the couch and Brenda was comforting her. He reiterated what the defense attorney had said, that she was losing her fragile grip on reality ever since she was a child, that she was hearing voices. And I was thinking, couldn't it have been her own voice that she was hearing, like, you're a failure, you're worthless? I mean, I think we all have the tendency to be critical of ourselves. But in his professional opinion, she lived in an alternate reality because her academic failures were inconsistent with how she saw herself and how she saw her world. Right. Her ego was bruised, as I said, because she was failing.
And on cross-examination, the prosecutor brought up the possibility of malingering again, but the doctor responded by saying that the attack itself showed clear signs of a psychotic break. He explained that it only lasted about 3.5 minutes. There was no motive. It was spontaneous and it was brutal, all of which indicated that Sydney was insane at the time.
Or she's just insanely selfish. I'd still call it a moment of intense rage. In other words, she snapped. She saw red, as they say. She didn't want her mom to find out the truth, so she hit her over the head with a frying pan. It would be difficult for a jury to reconcile these facts with Sydney's actions within 5 minutes. After the attack, she answered the phone, pretended to be her mother, and then hung up. She spoke with her dad and said everything was fine, and then she staged a break-in, told the police there was an intruder, and managed to use 2 different weapons to make it appear that this was some kind of crazy attacker. So what's the excuse? Well, the doctor said she was incapable of reasonable thought, and Sydney's break from reality was the worst he had ever seen in his 46 years of practice. Now, this would have been one of those times where I would have liked the prosecution to say, and how much are you being paid to give that opinion? Because we know that he's being paid for this specific opinion. But I keep thinking, could this be true? Well, to compound this opinion, the second doctor, Thomas Swale, a neuropsychologist, testified for the defense that he had just evaluated Sydney for the first time a few months before in July.
What was his take?
She was suffering from schizoaffective disorder, and it was the bipolar type. And she was in an acute psychotic state at the time of her mother's murder. He painted her as the victim, saying that she was suffering until finally getting medicated after the killing. And again, just like the other doctor, he stated there was no motive. And I kept thinking, why do they keep repeating this, that there was no motive? There was 100% a motive. It was her ego. She wanted to prevent her lies from being exposed. If that's not a good enough motive, then every killer who takes out witnesses to silence them wouldn't have a motive either. So can you tell them about the third and final doctor for the defense?
The third defense expert, Dr. Timmy, testified that Sydney's case was unusual and hard to predict. He explained that this typical risk factors for violence, such as history of violence, extreme childhood trauma, or substance abuse, weren't present in Sydney's situation.
But wouldn't that mean that the reasonable person would be led to believe this wasn't the case of a break from reality?
Well, he argued that Sydney's break from reality occurred when she was called into the dean's office and was told she had to move out. Over the following week, as she stayed in hotels and slept in her car, her paranoia grew, and she became increasingly out of touch with reality.
Or she was becoming increasingly aware that she could no longer get away with her lies, and she was beginning to realize her reality, that she was going to have to come clean, and she didn't want to. During this whole week he's referring to, she was texting friends and family, acting completely normal. How does he explain that?
In his opinion, Sydney's moments of lucidity, like when she texted with friends and family, were her attempts to cling to fleeting moments of normality. However, when she was alone with her thoughts, she would have been confused and paranoid, convinced that people were talking about her and telling her that she wasn't worthy. He testified that he conducted tests to confirm she wasn't malingering. He also described Sydney pretending to be her mother on the phone with administrators as a bumbling effort to hold on to her reality. His words.
Like a bumbling fool, right? Because that's how it's usually used, a bumbling fool.
Right, as in anyone who wasn't insane would know their own voice doesn't sound like their mother's, so this shows that she wasn't thinking clearly.
Yeah, but couldn't that be explained by something else?
Yes, and it was when prosecutors called their rebuttal witness, Dr. Olivia Obradovich, a clinical psychologist who interviewed Sydney for 2 hours before diagnosing her with borderline personality disorder and an unspecified anxiety disorder.
Now, that diagnosis is way more on point from what I know of individuals suffering from borderline than insanity.
Dr. Obradovich concluded that Sydney was malingering. She dismissed all the testing done by the defense witnesses, arguing that it only relied on self-reporting, and Sydney couldn't be trusted as a reliable narrator because she had her own interests in mind. Dr. Obradovich also told the jury that no test can definitively prove someone was insane at the time of a crime when conducted years after the homicide. She disagreed with the defense's diagnosis, rejecting the idea that Sydney was suffering from a psychotic break caused by schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. She stated that the best source of information from an insanity evaluation is what was said and felt at the time of the incident. She took a different approach from the other experts by focusing on what she knew to be true and comparing it to Sydney's statements and symptoms. She explained that it just didn't add up to schizophrenia. Dr. Obradovich also testified that it would have been rare for such symptoms to go completely unnoticed by everyone until the day of the murder.
Exactly. It's pretty convenient for Sydney that all of this showed up that exact day. The day she had to come home and come clean to her parents about her lies. She also disagreed with the expert witnesses who said that Sydney didn't have a motive to kill her mother, like I said. This doctor stated that Sydney would have done anything to keep from disappointing her mother and being proven a liar. That was her motive, and I agree. It was this doctor's opinion that Sydney was sane at the time of her mother's murder, as evidenced by the cover-up attempts. Now, there was something that was all over TikTok. I think the original clip got like 7 million views. It was from a moment at the trial when Sydney's defense attorney whispered something in her ear right before closing arguments. People tried again and again to decipher what he was saying. Many people thought he said, "I love you," which would kind of be weird, right?
Right.
Let's watch this clip that Plunder put together on her TikTok, and let's watch carefully and closely. Okay, so I can't hear what he's saying, but if you look at Sydney's lips as she responds, it does seem like she's saying, "I love you."
It does.
It does, like she's saying it back to him. Let's play it very slowly once again and watch closely here. Doesn't it look like she's saying, "I love you"?
It does.
Wow. Later, when the defense attorney was asked by the media what he said that day, here's his response.
Ted, as all of us can see how connected you are to your client, Sydney, and her family.
It's been tough. Sydney reminds me a lot of my daughter. And throughout this trial, I've tried to ask, what would Brenda do? And I asked that question before I started my closing argument. And what came back to me was, make sure that Sydney knows I love her. And before I started my closing argument, I leaned over and I said, "Sydney, Brenda loves you and I do too."
That's weird because it seems like it would have taken him much longer to say, "Sydney, I love you and your mom loves you too."
Right.
I think it's safe to say he said, "I love you" to her, which is kind of weird to me. And then watch her face.
Her face says it all.
She's like smiling. She's like kind of like flirting. It's weird. Yeah, that's really weird. I mean, he is fighting really hard for his client, so maybe it's not weird that he has love for her. And he did say, "Oh, she reminds me of my own daughter." But after this, it took the jury less than a day to find Sydney guilty of 2 counts of murder with felonious assault and tampering with evidence. I want you to hear this for yourself.
Verdict form number 1 as to count 1 reads, "We, the jury in this case, being duly impaneled, sworn, and affirmed, do hereby find the defendant Sydney Powell guilty of the offense of murder as charged in count 1. The form goes on to say, "And we do so render our verdict upon the concurrence of 12 members of said jury. Each of us said jurors concurring in said verdict signs their name hereto this 20th day of September 2023. Each juror has signed in ink next to his or her name.
Now, I noticed she was crying, but there were no tears. I mean, maybe she had cried them all out. But this did not go over well for those who still loved and supported Sydney, including her own family members. You could hear them crying in the background when the verdict was read. We have additional insight from one of the jurors named Jim Bishop, who talked to the media following the verdict. And here's what he said about why they found her guilty.
She knows that she did something wrong. She might have been insane when she did that, maybe, but we have to have these two things be true. And the second part was, does she know the wrongfulness of her actions? And we said, we think she does, because she was willing to go ahead and make up this huge story about this whole thing, and that meant she knew she was wrong and going to be in trouble. She had to figure a way out. She was making up a story about somebody intruding. We couldn't get past that. She's obviously trying to cover up. There's no other thing that could be going on here. And after reading hundreds and maybe thousands of texts, she was a normal college kid that lost track of her way because she didn't like what she was doing in college, and lots of kids in college lose that structure and have a difficult time. She wanted to hide from her parents, and so she started down this lying street, and she couldn't get out.
I do think it's interesting because at the end, what he said was they couldn't account for the fact that she staged that scene. Like, you can't be insane if you're like, okay, wait a minute.
Now what do I do?
Yeah. She knows right from wrong if she's like, oh, wait, my dad's coming. The police are coming. I'm going to put on a show. When daddy arrives, I'm going to cry out for him. And then I'm also going to pretend like someone came in here and attacked us.
Right.
That was weird. And when it was time for the judge to make a sentencing decision, Sydney's attorney asked the judge to consider all the letters they received in this case that were written on Sydney's behalf before making that sentencing decision. He said that his main concern was that Sydney receives the mental health treatment and placement that she needed. He didn't want her to be punished for a crime that he said Brenda would not have wanted her to be punished for. And again, I personally take issue with someone speaking for someone who is deceased. It's almost to his benefit. Like, I'm going to say that, Brenda wouldn't want her own daughter to be punished. I don't know. It seems wrong to me to say that. It's one of the first times I've ever heard someone say that. So let's listen to the Honorable Judge Kelly McLaughlin and her sentence.
Based upon the facts and circumstances of this case and in consideration of the relevant sentencing factors, including seriousness and recidivism, and applying the minimum sanction that the court has determined will protect the public and punish the offender without imposing an unnecessary burden on state and local resources, the court imposes the following sentence. On count one, ma'am, I sentence you to an indefinite sentence of 15 years to life in the Ohio Department of Corrections.
That was apparently the minimum sentence, 15 years to life. She would have the possibility of parole after those 15 years. But this case does not end here because she did appeal. And I want to talk about that because usually nothing happens. We talk about how they tried and tried again and it didn't go through. But this time, her conviction was overturned. Yep. And this just happened a few weeks ago. The appeal court said that the trial court committed an error by not allowing the defense to present what's called a sur-rebuttal case. Now, you know how the prosecution gets a rebuttal after the defense's case? Well, the defense argued they should have been allowed to go again after the prosecution because remember, they had that burden to prove the insanity part and they wanted to rebut the prosecution's star witness, Dr. Obradovich. The defense argued to the appeals court that their three witnesses had a combined 50 years of experience and spent a collective 30 hours with Sydney and conducted over 25 diagnostic tests, compared to Dr. Obradovich sitting with Sydney for only 2 hours and did no testing. They wanted to argue on rebuttal that that was improper, but they didn't get the chance, and the appeals court agreed. So she's getting a new trial.
Regardless, it doesn't change the fact that she went above and beyond to cover up her crimes, so I really don't think it's going to change the outcome of that case.
That's what I was thinking too. Like, how is it going to change anything? When we present the same evidence, it's going to be clear she still staged the scene.
Her family was probably relieved because they never wanted this case to go to trial in the first place. And this time, the defense is hopeful, especially since there is a new prosecutor now, and they're hoping to reach a deal to avoid a second trial.
Well, just because the family doesn't want Sydney to go to trial, I don't think that's good enough. I mean, how many mothers of killers or fathers of killers or family members or whoever doesn't want this particular loved one to be behind bars? That's not really a powerful argument, but it's tricky in this case because they are the victim's family too. So they're the victim's family and they're the killer's family, which is more uncommon.
Right. Her family shared that during the 3 years Sydney was waiting for trial and living with her grandma on the farm, she was getting better. She was on a combination of antipsychotics and antidepressants that were working for her. They also argued that Brenda wouldn't have wanted her daughter to be charged in her death. They believed that monitoring or probation would be the best outcome for both Sydney and their family.
Right. The prosecution at the time, of course, wanted to consider the family's wishes. However, they also had to weigh the public's best interest with the best interest of the victim's family. What message does it send to other teens that are struggling in college that they can get away with killing their mother in cold blood because they are insane and then they go live on a farm? And that's really tough because on one hand, I am compassionate. I have daughters that I love so very much. But again, to speak for Brenda from the grave seems weird to me.
And in the end, one impulsive decision completely changed the course of Sydney's life and the entire Powell family.
And we truly do wish both Sydney and her family healing, if nothing else. She lost her mother too, even if it was at her own hands. This has been a really difficult one and one that's very interesting to explore because we all have family members and loved ones. I think we can all put ourselves in their shoes on both sides, and we would love to hear your thoughts on this case below. Thank you so much for being here once again for another story.
And we'll see you in the next one.
Bye.